Hello. Today I'm going to talk about my third novel called Dominique's Confession. And I'm going to try to keep this spoiler free, but I am going to talk a bit about the behind the scenes, how I came up with the ideas, and just a little bit about the process of making it, maybe more than the other videos in this playlist, because I have a lot of the content of the records of this. So let's start, I guess, with the synopsis. How far will Dominique go to keep her secrets? The Roaring Twenties, Prohibition, the Motor City. Dominique, an alluring taxi dancer at a speakeasy, is something she's never told a soul. Her only chance at redemption rests in Jonathan Gamble Blackburn, a rich occultist whose interest in ceremonial magic piques her curiosity. What begins as a wager becomes an obsession as Dominique finds herself torn between the real world and Gamble's realm of disturbing seances, tarot readings, and prophetic nightmares. A historical tale of passion in a world of spiritualism, underground absinthe, and tempting mysteries that may shatter Dominique's heart forever. This novel, more than my other two novels, is a character study. And typically it would be a situation where you focus on one character for a character study, but I focused on two for this. The main character, Dominique, and her love interest, Gamble. And when I got the idea for this, I guess I was mainly influenced by Lady Chatterley's Lover. And, I think romance is quite hard to do successfully. I know there are many romance books out on the market, and I'm not claiming to say that I did it better than any of those. But what I am saying is that I think oftentimes romance is hard to elevate into something else. So when I got this idea, I initially thought of this character who had a secret, which I think is kind of fascinating. We all have our secrets, and I sort of modeled the book around this thing that she wanted to keep secret from everyone. And once I had that initial idea, it was quite easy to go from there, I guess. Because this is a character-driven story, more than a plot-driven story, I knew that I had to flesh out the two main characters as much as possible. So I actually did this mainly in a program called Novel Factory, and it was quite useful because it kind of gave you prompts of how to dive into the nitty-gritty of characters. So here are a few shots of some of my characters. Genevieve is Dominique, and the other character is Gamble, and these are just a couple pages from the character sheets, but the sheets were quite extensive. So, I mean, it got really deep into the minutia of who these people were, even to the point of posing questions and how they would answer them. So, by doing that, that really got me to understand where they're coming from. And once I sort of understood where they needed to come from, I was able to make the sort of tertiary characters. I guess once I started making those characters, the plot started making itself in a way. So I knew that they would each have their own friends and acquaintances and colleagues that would inform the story. And I think that's mainly where I got the idea that this was going to be an occult romance, which I don't see very much. And even on book sites, there aren't really categories for that. Book could be in romance or dark romance, but very rarely is that I've seen that there's like an occult section for romance. So I knew that the occult was going to be a big part of this book, and as I was creating the characters, I also knew that Detroit was going to be a major part of this book, but not modern Detroit, 1920s Detroit. And I've always been fascinated with the 1920s. It seemed like a very creative time, and I like the design and even the music. Everything I think is very interesting. But, I mean, the main sort of seed of where this started, I think, was my homesickness for my hometown. And, you know, one question that always comes up when I'm thinking about it is, how did it get that way? And if you don't know, I'm from Detroit. I currently live in South Korea, but I used to live in Detroit. And my first novel is much about what Detroit was like in the 2000s, early 2000s. But I lived through, you know, the 70s, 80s, and 90s there. And at that time, it was really in its darkest time. So I always wondered where it came from. And while making this book, I had to research a lot of that. And so I started researching some characters, famous people, actual people, that I thought might be interesting to include in this. So I had to go through a lot of newspaper clippings and, you know, read a bunch of books about it. But all in all, I started realizing that Detroit was one of the biggest cities in America at that time, and it was booming. To be honest, it actually makes me a little sad, because it would have been nice to live through that time in the city, in a different city. What I had to do here is recreate the 1920s, and it wasn't easy. I think of all my novels, this one is definitely took the most research, and not just historical research, but I also had to do research into fashion and trends and pop culture of the day. I also had to understand the geography of the city at that time, because it changed quite a bit. Even technology I had to go into a little more. I think one of the most important things was the fashion. I felt like if I didn't get that right, that it would take the reader out of the story, so I really, really focused on that. And, you know, it wasn't easy at first, because I didn't really know. I mean, I knew the fashion, you know, you see it in movies and things, but I didn't quite understand it from a design point of view. And being a book designer, I was quite curious about that, so I did a lot of research on it, and it's quite fascinating, actually. But once I sort of had that in my head, it was much easier to come up with the look of each character and the descriptions of them and their sort of personalities and styles. Another thing that was quite difficult was the fact that I was adapting some historical figures. Not too many, but there are a few that make appearances. And that wasn't easy either, because there are a lot of conflicting views of these people. And so some of it I had to invent, but I tried to get them as close as I could to what I read about them. You know, some of them are very famous, like Houdini, but others are infamous. I don't want to give anything away about the story, but there's a major event that happened in Detroit at that time, and I chronicle it throughout the second half of the book. And it was hard because there are a lot of different accounts of this story. And I'll just say it has to do with a crime, which is actually another part of this book, was the crime element of that time, because this is during Prohibition, so the gangs are running rampant. The Purple Gang in the Detroit area, and Al Capone's gang in Chicago. The two cities at that time were very connected. I think they still are to a degree, but at that time they were kind of sister cities, and a lot of the rum running and crime went between these two cities. So that was also something that was hard to do because there wasn't a lot of information. I really had to dive in to find it. But once I had it, it wasn't too difficult creating a few characters that were tied to it to use to bring that color into the story. One of the most difficult parts was the timeline. I had to be very aware of when certain things happened, and since I didn't live through these events, it was quite difficult plotting them, or like having a record of what happened when. So I had to make these very detailed outlines of not only the historical events or inventions that occurred at that time, or local things, but I also had to start figuring out how to put my story inside of it, which took a long time. I mean, I think it took maybe 3 months of constant work on this isn't even really counting the research phase. This is actually just working on the outline and the historical A to B, let's say. So once I had that, I printed up this vague outline, and I was able to sort of write in notes of some of the major events I was going to include and when they would happen, which informed the story, because I was able to have her, because the story is from her point of view, Dominique's point of view. So I was able to have her sort of comment on these events as they're happening, and also commenting on them from the perspective of when she wrote the story, which is supposed to be much later. So it was interesting, and I learned a hell of a lot about my town, not just my town, but that time in general. And it just seems like a really fascinating time. There was such an explosion of film and music and design and fashion. It's just amazing. So it took a while to do this, but eventually I was able to find the story, the chronological events of the story in this outline. And at that point, I had who the characters were, and I also had the chronology. So then I started putting all that into Scrivener, which is the writing program I use, and creating a lot of files and almost like a scrapbook in some ways, to try to soak up as much of the world as I could. So it was almost like when I was writing, it was like second nature. That leads me to how I wrote it. And I really wanted to write it fast. I wanted to write it almost like a machine. Usually when I write a book, there's sort of starts and stops and inspiration, like inspirational times and ideas that pop into my head, and then I furiously write a lot. But then I might take a little bit of a break and then go back to it. In this case, I really wanted to keep it all fresh in my mind, so I created this plotting device from a program called Pacemaker, which really kept me on track. It made me write a certain amount of words each day, which was quite difficult to keep it up for several months, while holding a job and everything else in life. So, but I will say this, having this program to help me keep track of it and keep me on task really helped me do it. And I was successful at it. And at the end of the first draft, it was quite messy, but I did it quickly, and I was almost surprised at how quick. I thought it would take much longer, but I think if you have a clear plan and you have a lot of the research done, it can come out quite quickly. From that point, I had to figure out how to write in someone's voice who had lived through the 1920s, and that was also difficult. This book was very hard to write. So I did a lot of research on flapper speak and sayings that people would say from that time, idioms and things. But I also watched a lot of films and TV shows set in that time and would jot down notes from these shows about, not just vocabulary, but the cadence and the rhythm of how these people spoke, at least according to these TV shows and movies. And so I was able to get a pretty good amount of, I would say, raw materials from this. And I read a couple books at the time too, and years back I read The Great Gatsby, and there's a lot in there. I didn't want to draw too much from that though, because I feel like that is the quintessential 1920s book, and I kind of wanted to keep it as far from that as possible, because it almost, I love the book, but it almost feels a bit like it's been turned into a cartoon of that time, or a caricature maybe. So I wanted it to feel more real than that. But eventually I was able to kind of get the voice in my head of how these people were to sound. And of course, the different characters, depending on their station, had different voices and slang, which was also not easy. It was fun though, I will say this. It was fun to write. That part especially, I would laugh a lot to myself as I was writing these things, because some of the slang is just ridiculous, and it's been so long since that time. When we think about that slang, we think about it as kind of, it doesn't feel real, I guess. But I wanted it to have that flavor, but I didn't want to put too much. I think it's a lot like cooking in that regard. If you put too much seasoning in, you'll ruin it. So I had to put just enough, and then also keep it fresh and sort of new. So there is modern language mixed in, I guess, but I was very careful about researching certain words to make sure that they were invented already. And that was also interesting, because I found out a lot of history about different slang words and sayings from that time and before that time. Once I had it written, I had to go through the editing process. That was pretty straightforward. I just went over it a bunch of times, and I had some proofreaders, a few friends of mine read it. Thank you, guys and girls. They gave me some notes, and I went through that, and they seemed to enjoy it. So there weren't too many content notes because I was quite thorough about building the story. So I don't think there was too much um, about the chronology that I got wrong. It was more just their thoughts about what they liked, or maybe if there was something they weren't quite clear on. And I went back and did a rewrite, and then I went through it again and did another rewrite. So there were several rewrites, and then eventually I designed the actual book, and because my degree is book design, so I designed the cover and the interior, and I printed it into this is the I guess the first printed draft of it, and I wanted to make it the physical book, so I could read it again and go through and read it from a different point of view, I guess, just to make sure everything worked. And I would find typos or things I might want to change. There wasn't a lot at this stage, but there were a couple things. But what this allowed me to do is see how it looked and make sure it was all correct, and then I was able to do the final draft. And then I published it. So all of my work has some element of occultism or esoteric ideas in it, and this book is no exception. The one difference from this book to my other novels is that this deals a lot more with the historical aspect of occultism, especially in Detroit. Detroit was a center of the occult at that time. Aleister Crowley lived there for a while, and the Masonic temple is like one of the biggest ones. I think at the time it was the biggest one in the world. It might still be, actually. So there was a lot of this undercurrent going on behind the scenes at that time. So I found that really fascinating, and I think it went well with the crime aspect of the book, because you think of this booming city and all these factories churning out these automobiles and everyone partying at these speakeasies. But there was a dark side to it, which is something I address quite a lot in the book. But I found that quite interesting, and I just, I think the genre of historical fiction is very hard to do. So it was a big challenge for me. My first book is more of a personal book. In my second novel, The Erotic Tales of Bucephalus, I will do a video on that at some point, but because it's an erotic book, I'm not sure if it will get kicked off of these sites. So I'm trying to find out the way that I can present it without presenting it, if that makes sense. So I will get to that eventually, but the second novel is more of a dream, I guess. So this one is the most real, even though it's a time I didn't live through. I really painstakingly tried to make it real, not just for the reader, but for myself. It was almost like time traveling in a way. And it gave me a lot of insight into my town. It's quite heartbreaking, actually. I thought it would cure my homesickness, but I think it actually made it worse, to be honest, because I almost was homesick for a place that didn't exist anymore, It added another layer to the city that I thought I knew. And it also taught me a lot about the race relations in the city and how different it was back then. And that's also quite sad, what it's become now. So, writing it broke my heart a little bit. in the way that I think, all of us kind of wish we lived in a different time, or in a time that was more ideal. So there's that part of me that wishes that I had lived through it, I guess. Now, some people have asked me if there is going to be a sequel, and there is going to be a sequel. I already have the title. It's going to be called Dominique's Revelation. And I've already started it, but mainly just some free writing about some experiences I went through and I'm dealing with that will kind of inform the book. So I haven't actually done the research on it, but I do know this. It will take place a decade after Dominique's confession. And maybe those two characters will come back together. I guess that's a minor spoiler. But I've also been asked if there will be a trilogy, and I'm not sure about that. I have a clear idea for the second book, and the second book is going to be more, maybe, I wouldn't say darker per se, because the first book has its darkness, but it's going to be more psychological and more about the struggle of trying to understand who we are and our relation to other people, the good things about us and the negative things, and how they impact our lives and the people that love us. So you can check that out whenever that comes out. I'm not sure when I'm going to write it, but I've been looking through some notes, especially to do this video, and it's got me a little bit more charged up about it. To be honest, Dominique's confession financially was kind of a failure. It hasn't sold very well compared to my other books. I'm not sure why that is exactly. I mean, to be honest, my erotica sells better than all my other work combined, but this book especially just didn't really click. Maybe it's because it's a mix of genres, I'm not sure. I think the stereotypical romance book is more of, I don't want to say cliche, but it doesn't have the darkness that this book has. So in that way, maybe it just can't find its audience. I'm not sure. But I know that I'm going to make the sequel, and that's going to be, I guess it's kind of a passion project. So that's why I don't exactly know when I'm going to make it, because I have a lot of other writing work that I'm doing in the meantime that I'm making money from. So I have to find time to squeeze it in between my job and my other writing. So I'm not sure. But I think it will be within the next year, I think, when I'll start writing it. So maybe 2 or 3 years before it's out. I guess the last thing I'll leave you with is, why should someone read this book? I think the perfect reader, in my mind, would be someone that is interested in occult mysteries, like things that cannot be explained, the paranormal, and obviously the meeting of two people who are very different, and their complicated relationship to bridge the two worlds, kind of Romeo and Juliet, or across the tracks kind of thing. If you like stories that really focus on character, I think you would enjoy this. Anyway, that's about all I got for today. Links are in the description for all the books that I mentioned. And that's it. I'll talk to you next time. Take care. Bye.